Today, we discuss the unique challenges faced by those of us diagnosed with high functioning or level 1 autism and why it's problematic to perceive this category of individuals as requiring fewer supports than are actually needed. Before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hi, Embracers!
Welcome back.
Before we dive into this topic, I want to clarify that we don't by any means intend to diminish the real struggles of profound autistics or those that are considered to be level 2 autistics. So we very much acknowledge their unique struggles and we totally support advocating for their needs as well. But today we just wanted to focus on the complexity of those that are considered to be high functioning. And now, especially after experiencing that myself and having kids that sometimes do and don't fall into that category, how having this specific label can often lead to needs being easily dismissed. It's kind of like a situation that is unique to high functioning. So we want to chat about that today.
All right, let's get started, Leah.
I figure you might have something to say.
Not really. I mean, because I'm just thinking of like some of the challenges that we've kind of gone through, essentially, like both with like the schools as well as like outside resources such as like therapy clinics and such. So, I mean, I think we'll kind of touch on that. I'm not sure if you have any particular place that you want to start with, and I'll.
So this is something that I feel is a dual experience with myself, but also from what I've seen happen with my kids. Now, our kids are diagnosed as level 2 and 3, but that was a couple years ago. And I'm thinking if they were to be reassessed, I have a feeling that at least the older one, probably not the younger one, but I think they would each get bumped up a level, probably be level 2 and 1 at this point. And what I have noticed is a lack of understanding or empathy when it comes to those autistics that are kind of on the borderline where it appears like you can camouflage or mask better with society. Therefore, when they see strange behaviors, they just think you are a non-autistic behaving poorly, or perhaps you are a non-autistic making unreasonable demands. And because of that, you get this additional stigma that is unique to high level autistics, basically level 1 autistics only. So that's why I wanted to talk about that, because it's something that is very unique to that high functioning category.
And it kind of does put us in like a weird place as well, because like, so I'm thinking of like at the schools and other like more professional settings of sorts. Like sometimes our kids might be perceived as being like rude because they're not falling into the same like social norms or behavior that the other kids are. So, I mean, and sometimes, and I'm not saying like sometimes they aren't, because sometimes like our daughter will kind of be sassy back to us, but it is like a delicate line to try and determine like, okay, what is kind of being, or the autism component versus like her being sassy and like kind of being like bratty, if she's being in a bad mood that day. So it is kind of like a weird kind of like gray area where you're trying to walk the line. So sometimes like when we're told like, oh, your kids weren't well behaved today, we kind of have to determine or try and ask and try and figure out like, okay, what specifically happened and what was the response, to try and see like, does it fall more on the autism side, or is it like she was actually like misbehaving and not listening to whatever was being asked of her? And I think for us, that's kind of one of the main struggles that I've kind of seen pop up more frequently, both in like the schooling system as well as like other like functions where they are socializing with peers, such as therapies or other little groups.
Yeah, so our older one is the one that would fall under that category, I think now. And I've noticed a similar thing where it seems like in some situations she is able to mask, which is another issue in itself, because do we actually want her to mask? Do we want her to be more authentic to her true self, which I lean more on that. But regardless of that, the school systems and public society puts pressure on autistics to mask in order to fit in and not be bullied, ostracized, or maybe if it's like a school setting, getting in trouble, for instance. And so what I've noticed is that our older one does kind of struggle with that line sometimes. And I mean, to no fault of her own. Again, I'm on the side of just accepting authentic autism and accommodating, but unfortunately, a lot of places have not caught up to that mentality yet, and we're still in the trying to fix and put people into a box type of mentality. And so, because of that, being high functioning is kind of a disadvantage, because I noticed, for instance, with my younger one, who is currently diagnosed level 3, but is likely now more of a level 2. I've noticed that she gets a lot more empathy and understanding from her teachers or from public society, essentially, than my other one, even when they're in the same circumstance, because she is more outwardly obviously autistic. Like, you can tell because she stims a lot more, she's more dysregulated, she doesn't really respond to her name and things like that. So it's more obvious with her that something's a little bit off according to the public perspective. But my older one, she's got really expansive vocabulary, she's really smart, she's like scoring the 99th percentile for everything. So she's really gifted, and because of that, people put these extra expectations on her that I feel like are unfair to place on an autistic kid, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum.
And I think part of that is because of like the rigid behavior. So like she's very much like structured with like education, for example. So if she's being told something that is not accurate based on like what she knows it to be, she will actually like kind of push back and fight that, kind of saying like, no, that's not right. That's not right. Which I mean, easily can be seen as like, oh, child misbehaving, not listening to an adult. But like with the keeping in mind, as far as her being autistic with the rigid behavior, it's not as much of a like behavior not wanting to listen to an adult. It's more of like trying to be told something that you know is not accurate or true, and trying to break that is just kind of more of a painful situation for her. So we've run into a few instances of that, kind of going through school and other locations. So I think that's one of the reasons why that kind of stands out, because I think oftentimes people kind of either aren't aware of some of the complexities for autism, or they kind of like brush it aside saying like, oh, she's pretty much like all the other kids, but she does some like quirky things, so she understands completely what's happening, and this is just a misbehavior. So I think there are those little instances where when you actually kind of put a magnifying glass to them, they become more apparent of some of the challenges that she in particular has to go through.
And that's why, like, way early on when we were talking about functioning labels, I said I'm not a huge fan, not because I'm like for or against it, but because I find them to be kind of useless. Like, they don't really help people understand what it means to be high functioning, low functioning, whatever it may be. And so having that high functioning label, I think to people gives them like a pass to think like, oh, you're good, you're fine. Because I know that for me as an adult who's diagnosed level 1, I have definitely had that like dismissive kind of behavior towards me in like work settings and even school settings when I was in college, because people tend to think that it's not that I have autism and like a learning disability that makes processing difficult and makes it hard for me to follow instructions that are all put in paragraph form. I need things kind of chunked out, listed to be able to follow it. Otherwise, I have a really hard time processing that information. And people don't think, oh, this is just a normal autistic person. They think, oh, this is like a dumb neurotypical person. And that is really frustrating because you're left with only a handful of choices. One of it is to like constantly disclose your diagnosis to try to justify your behavior, try to justify why you need certain accommodations. Even if it's as small as like how somebody talks to you, sometimes you need them to rephrase things, for instance. And it puts you in like this really awkward position where you're like, do I always have to medically disclose my diagnosis in order to get accommodations? Because society can't instinctively just be nice and like just not assume the worst of people. And so that's something that we've had to kind of navigate with our kids, that I have a little more experience now navigating it with myself, but seeing it happen to like my kids as a parent makes it a little bit harder emotionally, because you want to go out there and like fight for your kid, and you get really like offended or hurt when you see that your child is being misrepresented. And so that's something that we are learning to kind of work through now.
And the other thing I was going to say, I'm sure that you've run into it as an adult as well, is even if you think that you're understanding everything as it's being asked of you, sometimes there's like reading between the lines where it's the emphasis that is not necessarily said, but it's kind of implied. But unless if you're taking it as it's told to you, you could do everything right. But unless you're having, I don't even know what you'd call it,
Yeah.
like that additional
Reading between the lines.
yeah, like
Yeah.
ability to kind of see what the other meaning is that they're referencing, then that can kind of go overlooked. So it kind of does put you in an unfortunate place. I mean, not just you in particular, but like our kids as well, and the struggles that they'll, I mean, additionally have, because you either run the risk of basically kind of saying like, or disclosing like, hey, I have autism, I just want to make sure I'm understanding everything correctly, or you don't disclose, and then you're running the risk that you might miss some of those subtle things that might be picked up by the person next to you, for example.
Yeah, and for those of you listening who do have a kid who falls into the category of high functioning or level 1, keep in mind that that is something that is very possible for the future. It's something that has happened to me consistently and constantly. That exact same example that you just gave, Matt, is what happened with me from job to job to job, and it's actually the reason why I decided to seek out an autism diagnosis, because one of the feedback that I would consistently get at my jobs, no matter where I was going, was basically that I wasn't delivering what they were asking. And what I delivered was perfect, like great quality, amazing for what it was, but it wasn't what they were asking.
It was exactly what they were asking. It
Yes,
was
I
just
was very literal to the directions and
right.
instruction of what they asked. So that's something that I've always struggled with. And luckily, I fell into a job where the people were really empathetic and understanding and willing to work with me on clarifying what it was they were requesting. But like if they sent me an email that said, hey, I need you to, for example, put a website design together that has a happy face and two puppies in the corner, I would be like, okay, sure. I'd build a website with exactly a happy face and two puppies. And then I'd turn it in and they'd be like, why aren't these Dalmatians? And I was like, I didn't know they had to be Dalmatians. And they'd be like, but you know, you're working for the fire department. Of course it's Dalmatians. So it's like, I would not put those two things together. And so that's kind of that like reading between the lines that other people have very clear assumptions of like, oh, if you understand that this is for the fire department and we're asking for a picture of dogs, obviously put Dalmatians on there. Like I would not think of that naturally. I would need very specific instructions on exactly what dog, what smiley face, and all of that information in order to deliver what their vision was. And I feel like that's what our daughter goes through too in school.
Right. I mean, honestly, one of the examples was that they were supposed to draw like a, for like Halloween, draw like a monster or something. But
Frankenstein.
yeah, but give him like a sad face. And she was like wanting to give him like a happy face. And that was like one of the struggles. Like she was very like fixated on giving him a happy face. But that was kind of seen as like a not following instructions sort of thing. But then thankfully like her special education teacher like allowed her to do a frowny face after she had completed the assignment. So thankfully there was like the shift there where they were able to work with kind of her rigid mindset with the activity versus just kind of having her go along or perceiving it as her not following instructions and being like disrespectful to the teachers, which I'm leaning towards that she probably wasn't based on
Yeah.
kind of the context of what we've gotten there.
Yeah, and then there was the other example where she was doing some testing, and in the testing, this is something I also struggled with growing up. They asked a question, I think it was like, "What do you
I
sit on?" or something like that,
it was
and
yeah, I remember.
the answer was what? Do you remember what the
So it
answer was?
was it was basically like what do you sleep or what can you sleep on or something, and it was like a bench, a sofa, and
A
a
chair.
chair or something.
Yeah.
And she was locked into the mindset like I sleep on a bed, like my answer
Yeah.
is not here. I don't, and she couldn't answer the question because she was so locked into when I sleep I sleep on a bed and it's not there.
Yeah, and
And
it's
so
not an
like
option.
yeah, so her special education teacher was trying to like work through like, okay, well, if that's not here, what is something else that is kind of like a bed to try and get her to the answer, but she wasn't able to make that leap to the next
And
answer.
that one was so funny to me because I remember asking Matt, I was like, "Do you know the answer?" Because like I think the exact same way. I was like, I would say bed. None of these other options make any sense to me, and I might as well just be guessing because I have no idea what that answer would be.
I think we're going with sofa.
Okay,
We're going
well,
with sofa
yeah. See,
because yeah.
I think sofa sitting. I don't think sleeping. I mean, I guess if you're in trouble, Matt, maybe that's what it is. You're used to sleeping on the couch, and I'm not.
That's basically a second bed. Right. But I mean like you would have to be able to utilize like, okay, common, or you'd have to foresee like the context that they're using it in and know like, yes, they could be talking about like a lazy boy chair, which yes, you can technically like sleep in, but in this like just the structure, you can kind of, well, some people can tell that it's more of like a standard chair or office chair or like something that is not comfortable because of the other answers they're giving.
And that's something that I have personally found very difficult to do growing up. Like, that is something I still struggle with to this day. So it's not something that I feel like my kids will outgrow. So I think that's an area that there just needs to be more awareness in the community, because that's not something that I feel like we can change because it's instinct. And that's something that's a little trickier to deal with. So I'm hoping that in the future people will have more empathy towards people who process things a little bit differently when it comes to that. And maybe they will make tests that are a little more accommodating. But for right now, that's not where we're at. And it's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because it isn't straightforward. There's assumptions towards the answers that could be right, could be wrong, but they're hoping that your assumptions in one direction give you the answer. So it's not
Yeah. They're
not really
structured
fair.
they're structured around neurotypical thinking, which is
Right.
really frustrating. The other thing that I thought about when it comes to like the high functioning label that can be problematic, that's outside of just these practical hands-on type of situations, is insurances and like the medical world. If you don't have like if you have a high functioning label or you're considered level 1 autistic, one of the negatives to that is oftentimes that insurance companies could potentially not see you as like a seriously needing therapy type of candidate. I honestly think that insurance companies tend to be out for their own interests, unfortunately. Like, it's clearly like a profit making type of industry.
Right.
And because of that, they're all about how can we make a quick buck? And oftentimes, high functioning autism is not the way to do so for them. And that's one of my concerns as well.
And we quite recently, I mean, I mean, not the insurance side of things, but kind of experienced like a autism facility, kind of evaluating them based off of some of the characteristics that we kind of mentioned a little bit. So, like, our girls have gotten what,
They've been
re-diagnosed
diagnosed like
like
five
five
times.
times.
Yeah.
But we just went to this new facility because our youngest baby is in one of the tests.
Studies.
Yeah, that they're doing.
They're not testing on her.
Well, like, yeah, but like tracking, like, I don't know, genetics or family line, whatever you want to call it. That's my description of it, and I'm sticking with it. So they evaluated our two older girls, and it was just a speech assessment, just seeing
Yeah.
how they.
It was an SLP.
Right, but then their comments were basically like, well, they like kind of like barely qualify as like being autistic, and I'm like, well, that's only like one element of like their world. And like our girls really do a great job of like scripting from TV shows. Like if they just go, they would just keep talking about whatever their TV show is and reliving that. So I don't really think that you can make that assessment just given such a narrow perspective of like our kids. But they were almost kind of making it sound like, well, they're kind of borderline, like as even like qualifying. And I'm like, but you guys are like an actual like autism facility. You think that you would use more qualifiers to make a determination than instead of just like, yeah, we're just going to pick one, and then depending on how they do, then we kind of judge if they're autistic or not. So I was kind of let down a little bit by like a group claiming to actually be like focused heavily with like the autism world.
To be fair, they did say it was an abbreviated assessment, so I
Okay.
think that maybe a thorough one with a team, because I feel like I'm SLPs are gonna hate me for this comment, and I love my SLPs. So out there, y'all, I love you guys. You guys do amazing work, but I don't think an SLP should be qualified to make an autism diagnosis, just because like there's a lot more than just speech and pragmatics involved. So I feel like having just one person do it is not the best. But that again just leads to that complexity of the medical world and the fact that just because you're labeled high functioning doesn't mean you don't have like needs. For example, sensory needs. A lot of high functioning individuals like myself have sensory needs. We're just really discreet about them. So I can just throw in some earbuds. I can just like fidget with my clothes without people knowing. Like I can try to get some therapy putty and like play with that, and people just see that as like a desk thingamabob. They don't see it as like I need this because I need it to concentrate. And so it's more challenging, I think, for somebody who's considered a level 1 autistic or high functioning autistic to be able to justify those things. So like if you needed to have the therapy putty to concentrate, you would have to basically prove to your job or school, for example, that it actually helps you and is not just going to quote unquote distract everybody around you. And I find that so frustrating because if you have like a level 3 autistic who is verbally stimming, maybe they're rocking, maybe they're like all over the place, they're nonverbal, they're not even going to question whether or not they need the therapy putty if they basically not ask for it, but if their parent does, if they're nonverbal, however that may be. And I feel like that's where that kind of imbalance is, where it seems like high functionings are considered like you don't need these accommodations. Whereas level 2, level 3, everyone's like, of course they need these accommodations.
And we all see that come IEP season, because that's like
Yes.
constantly the fight of like, these are necessary for them functioning in the classroom, so please don't take them away. So, I mean, and this past year we've seen no shortage of things trying to be taken away. Both resources as far as occupational therapy within the classroom, as well as like special items like our daughter would have with her for transitions. Both of those had been like tried to be taken away or minimized throughout the year, which we always have to make sure like we are very much aware is what is current in our IEP to make sure that they have what they need to kind of move forward.
Yes. And we're not the only ones. I've heard stories from other parents who are struggling with the exact same thing in school systems across the United States. Like everybody seems to be struggling with the same thing, where it seems like it's hard to advocate for your child, especially if they're high functioning, to have these supports in the school system, because it seems like the school's kind of pressuring families to like push them out of an IEP as fast as possible and try to get them off of the accommodations essentially, which, if you know anything about IEPs, if anybody tries to force you off of one, fight for your IEP, because once that's gone, you really have no protections for your kid. So that's I think a harder battle to fight with a high functioning kid versus one that's lower functioning, because again, there's all these assumptions tied to, well, I don't see you verbally stimming. I don't see you swaying back and forth. I don't see you eloping all the time. Therefore, you must not need accommodations. And I find that extremely frustrating, especially since the high functioning kids are the ones that are masking. And masking itself is extremely taxing.
Right, because I mean, I was even just thinking like last year for our oldest, they were basically telling us in an IEP meeting like, oh, she doesn't need, or we're going to reduce her occupational therapy to something like I think it was like a consultation for like 15 minutes. Like I can't remember if it was like a
Once
month
a
or
month.
right,
Yeah.
and they were showing like, oh look, she's able to draw these shapes on her own. But then they had also, or the therapist had mentioned that it would work better for her schedule if she reduced it to like a consultation 10 minutes a month. And I'm like, so like right there, you're admitting to us like it's like kind of based on your schedule versus like what the needs are for her. But I mean, she's in private OT, I mean, is still in private OT for a solid hour, I mean, every week. So, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a struggle because they lack like the resources at the school where they can't offer it. So they're constantly trying to pull it off of kids that they qualify as acceptable or at least passing. But yeah, I mean, she's still definitely in occupational therapy, even though this was last year that they were basically trying to or move these services. So it's like an ongoing struggle that ultimately sometimes I feel like might be a losing struggle because at the end of the day, you're basically expecting them to try and put together these resources that they may or may not have.
Yeah, unfortunately, because the schools are understaffed and the funding is not managed properly, it just feels like there's always a constant squeeze to try to get people off of IEPs because there's not enough therapists to go around. Which, I mean, I understand it's not the teacher's fault, it's not the staff's fault. That's a higher level issue. But the consequence of that is that logically, who do you think they're going to try to skim off the top? It's going to be the higher functioning kids. They're going to be the ones that get kicked out of all the therapies, the consults. Like, they're going to be the ones that lose out on what they need. And those level 2, level 3, lower functioning kiddos will continue to get the services that they need, which again, I'm completely for, but I don't think that it should be a dog eat dog type of situation. It shouldn't be like everybody's in the ring fighting for the same accommodations. Like, I think that we definitely have to consider all of the spectrum from high functioning to low functioning and everything in between. And it reminds me, Matt, do you remember that conversation I had with somebody on, I think it was on Facebook? Somebody had commented because I shared the experience of like my quote unquote higher functioning autistic child, the older one. And they basically, out of nowhere, just came and decided to say that our child doesn't deserve insurance because they're too high functioning, essentially, that insurance should only cover for the extreme of cases of profound autism, and that anybody who has a child who's not profoundly autistic should not be covered by insurance because in their view it's taking resources away from their autistic child. And that to me
Right.
is a very scary thought. It's very scary for me to think that somebody thinks that they have the right to remove services, supports, and insurance coverage from people who just don't struggle as intensely as their child does, even though they still can't function in life.
Right. It's kind of like the idea like you break your hand and someone else breaks their arm, but we're not going to help you like with your broken hand because someone else has a broken arm, which is a bigger bone. So I mean, like I'm just kind of thinking of it as like that. I mean, both need resources. Yes, the lower functioning might need more therapies, so, but that doesn't mean necessarily to take them from the kids who also require them just to satisfy your own benefit. Because I'm thinking of like our own local therapist office. I mean, right now our actually just the older one is waitlisted for physical therapy, but they kind of handle it in a I mean, they kind of see what the need is and where they can kind of find therapists for them. I mean, once we come off the wait list. So I mean obviously everyone has to like play their time on the wait list. There's no way to really like jump it. So it's kind of like they support like the families that have been in the program the longest before they start catering to the other ones. But then they also focus on who needs the therapy more so they can try and build the blocks. So it's kind of a delicate structure of who needs the most therapy and kind of the ones that still need it but have been in the program the longest to try and work its way through who can get the therapy with limited resources.
Right. And I can understand that. So to me, that's like when I worked in the ER, you could have a patient who's in there with a very high fever. Maybe like it's getting, tricky. It could be something that, is a serious concern. But then you get a call and somebody's rushing in. Somebody just came in from like a car accident, has a severe head injury, and could potentially be close to death. And they have to pause what they're doing with the person with that fever and go and move to that other person because it's a more immediate need. But once that's done, they come back to the other patient and keep caring for them. So I feel like that to me is understandable. But the debate that I'm hearing is basically like we should not accept anybody into the ER who has anything short of a head injury. And I can't agree with that because that I feel like just is an injustice to everybody. So that's why we wanted to talk about the high functioning. This has been an experience that my child is going through, but it's also something I've personally experienced specifically in a lot of careers. So I would anticipate my kid's gonna struggle with this if she's able to function properly in a job. She's gonna have a hard time just because society doesn't seem to empathize with the struggles of those who have high functioning level.
And it's unfortunate, I mean, because it almost gears them towards a career, like it kind of limits their career options because they almost need to kind of not stay away, but choose career paths that are less engaging with, I guess,
People.
like customer service esque or, yeah, people
No,
essentially.
all people, because that's why I decided to do remote. And that's why I decided to do a job that is more independent work based. Because if you are in a job that is more collaborative or you have to have a lot of like touch time with like your boss or supervisor, you have the same issue. The more you talk to them, the more likely there is to be a misunderstanding. So, as somebody who is like level 1 autistic, my advice would be try to gear your child or steer your child towards a career that's going to allow them to work independently without having to rely too much on that social engagement, because that is the part that gets tricky.
Right. So, I mean, but even that, I mean, that's kind of a struggle because, I mean, it definitely narrows of all the possible careers and then which ones have less contact with, like, I mean, your typical coworker or clients and that sort, and then focus on those individuals because that will be your greatest success, essentially, career wise. But definitely makes it more challenging than just the whole plethora of careers.
So, what do you guys feel? Do you feel that the high functioning label is more helpful or harmful? Have you or your child experienced any discrimination due to being labeled as level 1 or high functioning? Or do you believe that these labels are not really relevant anymore and don't impact your child one way or the other? Let us know in the comments on YouTube or Facebook at Autism Wish, or continuing the conversation with us on our private Embracing Autism community. Don't forget to become a member today at autismwish.org for exclusive access to that community where you can hang out with Matt and me. We can discuss this conversation and other topics, and also have lots of fun jump in and out chat rooms. So thanks for hanging out, everybody, and we will see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.